Continuing on and looking at the factions that existed during the time of the American Revolution and their reactions to the Articles of Confederation, or the idea of a more centralized governmental system in general, we can look at some explanations of these main views, conservatism and radicalism. The historian Merrill Jensen, who writes a couple books that are great in explaining this time period. I think he has one called A New Nation, and it's all about the Articles of Confederation. And then this one, where I got this quote from, the Articles of Confederation, is another book, but they're both in the footnotes of the ebook for this course. But anyway, he writes, the conservatives who had opposed the revolution and who went along with it only when they saw no alternatives, as well as many who were not opposed to independence, wanted supreme political authority to be placed in a central government, which could exercise coercive power over the states and their citizens. They valued the British connection for the very definite advantages it gave the ruling class of the colonies. When faced with the fact of independence, they demanded the creation of a government which would in some way function as a bulwark of conservative interests. In other words, as a substitute for the British government. So not all conservatives are exactly the same in this time period. And remember, conservative is not something they would have been calling themselves. It would have been a name applied to them afterward, just like the radicals in later study of history of this time. But this conservative camp includes everybody who didn't want to go along with independence and the separation movement from Britain for various reasons, but went along with it reluctantly, even to those who did want independence. So, and then there's some sensible reasons for not wanting independence in the first place, just to be fair. So they range in opinion to someone like Ben Franklin, who does push for independence, but also will desire and participate in the Constitutional Convention to set up a more central government. Now, I think the core of this conservative view is here in this kind of highlighted part of the quote, that they wanted supreme political authority in a central government. So it's not just that the political authority would be dispersed. No, the authority would be pulled together in one convenient location of the final decider over governmental authority. And it would be one government that these elites would either participate in, or that they would have one government to go to protect their interests. And the radicals are going to be opposed to that idea because they see the states, and within the states even further, like Thomas Jefferson even goes down to what would be called like a ward system in his ideas, is that power is dispersed across not only territorial regions, but across people, and is not just lodged in the hands of a few in one government. And so, but the conservatives believed that this would be one government would keep order, would regulate trade, regulate commerce, would be able to be a bulwark of conservative interests and substitute for the British government, maybe in more of like a mercantilistic economic view rather than a more free trade economic view, that they would be protected by laws, regulations, commerce. And so this is the conservative worldview of wanting to separate from Britain in particular, but with the promise of a large central government to defend their interests. Radicalism is different. Murray Rothbard, the economic historian, philosopher, writes, the radicals were engaged in fighting a war against central government. Its taxation, restrictions, and privileges, and were not about to favor establishing an equivalent at home to what they were fighting to eject from American shores. So the radicals, they were fighting against Britain in particular, like the conservatives, but this was a larger general statement against this idea of a large centralized taxing state that could act coercively as a modern nation state in which people who had connections politically, economically, all these things could have more influence with this one state, and that if this one state becomes corrupt, then it's very difficult to exit. And so the radicals believe the power ought to be shrunken down, ought to be limited in its scope, ought to be brought within the accountability of the local people. And all of these things are not going to be fully realized by any means by the state. However, the government of Rhode Island is going to be a lot closer to the people and have the opportunity for more accountability. And so the radicals are fighting in principle against all and any centralized government. Now, the states are a form on a smaller scale of a centralized government. They are still coercive nation-state models. That being said, if Rhode Island starts oppressing its people in tyranny, but there's the option that those people could go to New Hampshire, Rhode Island's power and incentive to do those things is limited. However, if a US government, a government over all the states, having the coercive power to coerce the states and therefore all the people, if that government acts in a corrupt way, it's much harder to exit because any state you go to would be within the union. That's just one example of the potential of that power. Plus, it's less representative. The representation of Rhode Island, Georgia, Virginia, while it may not be perfect, while it may not be equal, while it may not be right, and it has all the opportunities for the problems described with a larger scale, when it is on that bigger scale, people trying to represent the whole United States, everyone gets less representation. So this is why the US government earlier on, it was viewed as almost ambassadors from different countries when they sent senators or other things. Now they spoke similar languages, similar religions, similar tradition, culturally, in a lot of ways. However, they were separate. And that separation was something they valued because it was a limitation on the threat of government power. threat of government power didn't go away. However, they felt that they had a better chance with it on a smaller scale than a larger, unwieldy scale of the whole United States. Plus, the uniting together under a centralized government creates competition not only between the people of that type of confederation or even later a union, but creates competition between the states, that whoever controls the federal government can coerce the other states. And we start to see those divisions taking place and eventually lead to civil war over particularly the issue of slavery. Whereas individual states were dealing with slavery, some rightly, some wrongly. So anyway, radicalism was not about to replace, after they got rid of Britain abroad, they were not about to replace the same system, Britain at home, or an adjusted system, but still, in principle, a coercive nation state. Show an example of this is John Dickinson. Show two examples of conservative and radical. John Dickinson, very influential during this time, the American Revolution, and one of the primary writers of the first draft of the Articles of Confederation. The draft even became known as the Dickinson draft before the Articles were amended. Ben Franklin also heavily influenced this particular draft. Ben Franklin would be of that kind of conservative school of thought as well. Called for a permanent executive council. This is what people sometimes say, well, we had presidents before George Washington. In the sense that a few served on an executive council for the Articles of Confederation, yes. But in a true sense, no. There was not a U.S. presidency as it comes to be defined in the Constitution or George Washington. It was nothing like the president of the United States. Each state had one vote. Now, to Dickinson's credit here, each state is accredited one vote. There's an equality between the states because they are sovereign political units. Rhode Island is little. Virginia is a lot bigger. And then Massachusetts has a lot more people than Rhode Island, and it's bigger in a size way. Some start to have concerns about that why does little Rhode Island get the same votes as states that are much bigger in population and geographical territory? It's because the territorial or population size of Rhode Island does not matter if we understand the states to be states. That is, sovereign, free, independent political units. It's just like saying, well, how come Switzerland can make these decisions, but a much larger territory and political state? How come Switzerland gets to? Because Switzerland's its own country. France is its own country. Germany is its own country. So those little states that are across Europe, they're sovereign political units. That's how the American states were understood and were fighting to be understood by Britain and the world. It was not that they were one, but that little Rhode Island is now its own country with its own borders, government, taxation, and all those things could have their own problems. But that's why when Rhode Island joins into this group, this potential confederation, it receives the same voting power as any other state. Because you could think of the situation if they said voting will be based on the population of the state or the size of the state in geographical territory. Rhode Island and other states would never join, because if they did, they run the risk, real or imagined, of being outvoted by states that have more people or more land. And if you jump into a situation voluntarily where you know that you can always be outvoted and never achieve any of the goals that you want or even have a chance necessarily, unless the other states happen to vote with you, then why would you join? Why would you take that risk instead of remaining independent? And so each state would have one vote. Now, this becomes a huge point of debate when it comes to the Constitution. How are states to be represented? Equally or proportionally based on population? And as we'll see in the future, hopefully, the framers of the Constitution tried to do a hybrid. Equal in the Senate, every state gets 2 senators, unequal proportionally in the House based on population. But in a sense, they still really didn't deal with the problem. Because if you mix both, you still run into the fact that there will be competition between states for power and resources via access to the central government. Sort of like in Lord of the Rings, the one ring to rule them all becomes the central government. States realize that if they control that apparatus, they not only control the power and resources of the union and can have their way, but they can also now use that apparatus to control other states. And all the states, the unions, start to recognize this and attempt this. And then there's a sectionalism between North and South, both trying to do this, and West, all competing. And through that competition is the empowerment of the central government. Rothbard writes, the powers left to the states in the Dickinson draft were negligible. So the draft does get changed. It does get amended. But when Dickinson wrote it, the states had a lot less power available to them if they agreed to it, which they likely would not have if the Dickinson draft was followed. Now, one key power that was left out was the power to tax. This is the most significant part, possibly, of the Articles of Confederation, is this conspicuous absence of the coercive power of taxation. This is also the main substantial change in the federal government outlined by the future Constitution. And once they get the Constitution, tax they did. Much more than and on more items, including tea, than the British ever dreamed of. But it was taxation with representation. However, it was clear that the power under the US Constitution the power for government had been much expanded. And now it was a competitive situation in regard to government control. But this power to tax, now, this is very problematic for the people in the government. The people working with the articles, they are very frustrated by this later. But the American people are not concerned by this. Some often view this time as a time where the American people were chaotic, where they were upset, and where they demanded a new government under the Constitution. And the American people demanded nothing of the kind. They had little to no awareness or concern, for the most part, of the Confederated government or the later federal government, other than voting and things of that nature. Interaction with the federal government of the United States was fairly minimal. And so this lack of power to tax is key. Even brings up, is it really a government if there's no power to tax? Now, this doesn't mean they never had any money. They could do what was called a requisition to the states, meaning they had to request money. The states had to tax if they chose to agree. And then the states would send money. Now, the states had the prerogative of saying no. And when an entity or groups have the ability to say no to taxation, that creates a significant limit on power. Now, we also may think that, well, if the states can pay voluntarily, there will be an undersupply, or they'll never pay at all. They don't always pay when requested, but just like we pay for things on the market, when we vote, when we want things on the market and we vote with our dollars, sometimes we respond to advertisements, sometimes we don't. Now, this book, The Collective Action Under the Articles of Confederation, is an economic and historical study of this very particular issue. And it asks the question, it says, it shouldn't be surprising that the states didn't pay that much a lot of times, or didn't pay much when they weren't being coerced. What's surprising is that they actually did pay quite a bit, more than might be expected. Why did the states, if they didn't have to, donate to the cause? Because they did. So the surprising thing is not that they didn't pay or didn't pay as much. The surprising thing is that the states actually paid more than what a lot of economic predictions might have posited, based on the fact that they didn't have to. So Congress, as I said, had to request tax from the states, and the states would levy a tax if they agreed, and then the states would send the money to Congress. Very slow, very inefficient system, but purposely so. The government efficiency, some people complain against government because it's inefficient, and that's true to a large degree, but government inefficiency is sometimes built in on purpose or included by providence because it limits power. Let me just finish by reading this quote from Radical. This is Thomas Burke, who comes in and gives the biggest critique to the Dickinson draft. And we'll pick up with this next time. But let me just read this quote as we finish here. It says, the more experience that I acquire, the stronger my conviction that unlimited power cannot be safely trusted to any man or set of men on earth. This is a question that I believe cannot be answered but by plain declaration that power of all kinds has an irresistible propensity to increase desire for itself. These and many other considerations make me earnestly wish that the power of Congress was accurately defined and that there were adequate checks provided to prevent any excess. Even thus early, men so eminent as members of Congress are willing to explain away any power that stands in the way of their particular purposes. Power will sometime or other be abused unless men are well watched and checked by something they cannot remove when they please.